Picture this. It's January the 2nd, 1967. You're 30,000 feet over North Vietnam. A formation of American fighters is inbound, flying the same route, the same speed, and the same altitude as the fighter bombers that fly this corridor every single day. On the ground, North Vietnamese controllers scramble MiG-21s to intercept what looks like on every radar screen and every radio call just like another bombing raid. But it isn't. 12 minutes later, 7 of those MiGs are burning wreckage scattered across the jungle. Welcome back to the Jaxom Talks channel. If you're new here, do me a big favour, hit that like and subscribe button. It helps me way more than you know. And if we keep growing the channel, I keep promising to improve my videos as often as I can. So let's back it up a bit. Way back. Let's go back to 1953, 3 years before the Phantom II meant anything at all. McDonnell Aircraft out of St. Louis made very good living building airplanes the Navy didn't necessarily want, but occasionally needed. The original FH-1 Phantom, the F-2H Banshee, and the distinctly underwhelming F-3H Demon. By the early 1950s, McDonnell's engineers looked at the Demon, looked at the calendar, and decided the company needed a genuinely new pitch to the Navy before someone else got in there first, with something better. So in September 1953, McDonnell walked into the Navy's office with a proposal for something they called, without a trace of irony, the Super Demon. It wasn't a fighter at all. Well, not yet. It was a single-seat, single-engine attack aircraft, built around a modular nose that could be swapped between mission packages. The Navy said, that's interesting. Nah, I don't think we'll do anything with that, thank you very much. 2 quiet years of redesigning followed, during which McDonnell kept a year open for what the Navy actually was worried about, which by 1955 was fleet air defense. So Soviet long-range bombers were the nightmare scenario of the moment, and the Navy needed something that could sit high above a carrier group, in any weather, day or night, and shoot just about anything that got close before it had a chance to launch its anti-ship missile. On May 26, 1955, 4 Navy officers arrived at McDonnell's offices with an entirely new set of requirements, and the single-seat Super Demon quickly died on the table. What emerged instead was a 2-seat, 2-engine, all-missile fleet defense interceptor. That's right, no gun, no bombs, just raw power and radar. McDonnell would build the muscle, the Navy would provide the philosophy, and the philosophy in 1955 was simple: missiles are the future, dogfighting's the past, and any fighter pilot who tells you otherwise just hasn't read the memo yet. Now that 2-seat layout deserves a beat of its own because it explains the airplane for what it actually was. The McDonnell engineers looked at the sheer volume of information an all-modern, all-weather interceptor radar was about to throw at a single pilot. They concluded that no human could fly a jet, read the radar scope and manage weapons at Mach 2 simultaneously without something getting missed. So they split the job, the pilot up front and the radar intercept officer in the back seat. It was a decision made purely for the workload management in 1955, and it would end up mattering enormously a decade later in ways nobody in that room would have ever predicted. The prototype was designated XF-4H-1, powered by a pair of brand new General Electric J79 afterburner turbojets, which at the time were amongst the most powerful jet engines in existence. 2 prototypes were ordered in 1955. On May 27, 1958, at Lambert Field in St. Louis, McDonnell's chief test pilot Robert C. Little took the first one into the air. Now, it was not by any conventional standard a beautiful aircraft. It had a big drooping nose, cranked oddly angled wings, with the outer panels tilted by 12 degrees for stability while the inner wing stayed flat, a tailplane that dropped downward on a steep negative angle for exactly the opposite reason. The missiles were buried half submerged in the belly to cut drag. Every single one of these features existed because a wind tunnel had tested and revealed that some new horrifying stability problem had emerged, and McDonnell had just bolted on a fix rather than start the whole design over. The result looked like it had been assembled by 3 engineering teams who never once spoke to each other, probably argued with each other, but somehow were all correct. It very nearly went supersonic on that first flight. Little had planned to push it through Mach 1, but a hydraulic leak had forced him to leave the landing gear down as a precaution, keeping the flight subsonic. It was a small anticlimax, and the record books wasted no time in getting their revenge, because over the following 2.5 years, the Phantom, renamed the F-4H-1 and eventually just the F-4, went on to set 12 records for speed, altitude and time to climb records. Some of the pilots flying those record attempts were young Navy aviators named John Young and Richard Gordon, both whom would later leave the atmosphere entirely on as NASA astronauts. This was, in other words, an airplane that attracted a certain type of pilot, even before it had been proven in combat. The Navy began taking deliveries in 1960, and the Marine Corps close behind. But the Phantom's real story begins with a small case of inter-service jealousy. Now, the US Air Force, watching the Navy fly this thing, initially wanted nothing to do with it at all. After all, a Navy jet, built for carrier decks, complete with folding wings and a tailhook, was not exactly the Air Force pride material. Then, in 1962 joint evaluation exercise, Air Force F-106 Delta darts went up against the Navy's F-4 in mock combat and got soundly beaten. Now that got everyone's attention very quickly. By May 1963, the Air Force had its own version flying, the F-4C, which would go in to be built in far greater numbers than anyone at McDonnell's Navy sales decks could ever imagine. By the time production wound down in 1979, 5,195 Phantoms had rolled off the assembly lines, more than any other American supersonic fighter before or since. The US Air Force alone took delivery of 2,874 of them. To this day, it remains the second only to the Soviet MiG-21 for total production of any jet-age fighter anywhere. Now a quick note on its name. McDonnell had already built one Phantom, the FH-1, a straight-winged first-generation carrier jet from the 1940s that had nothing else in common with the airplane we're discussing today beyond the badge on the tail. To avoid confusion between the two, McDonnell's new fighter was formally christened Phantom II, a name that somewhat charmingly almost nobody actually used in casual conversation once the airplane reached the fleet. Now, before we go any further, a quick note on the model numbering, because the Phantom accumulated more variant letters than most any other fighter in history, and half the fun of Phantom trivia is knowing your F-4Bs from your F-4Gs. So, the F-4A and F-4B were the earliest Navy models. The F-4C was the Air Force's first version, essentially a B model with the Air Force specification electronics and dual flight controls, so either crew member could fly the jet. The F-4D refined the C's model's radar and weapon systems for the Air Force. The F-4E arrived in 1967, and this was the big one. It finally added the internal M61 Vulcan cannon. We'll get to that shortly. And with a lengthened nose, more fuel, and slanted wings for better turning performance, it became the most numerous single variant ever built and the backbone of the Phantom exports around the world. The F-4J was Navy and Marine Corps' definitive late-war version with improved radar and stronger carrier-optimized airframe. The F-4G was converted from surplus E models with specialized Wild Weasel radar hunting. We'll spend some real time with this later in the video. And running alongside all of them, the RF-4B and the RF-4C and RF-4E swapped the nose cannon and radar for cameras and sensors, flying unarmed reconnaissance missions for over some of the most heavily defended airspace of the entire Cold War. Keep those letters loosely in your head, we'll be using them a lot later. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the missing gun. Now remember, this airplane had been designed from the outset as a missile-only interceptor for fleet air defense. The incredible theory being that with radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrows and heat-seeking AM-9 Sidewinders, a fighter simply would never need to get close enough to use a cannon. That theory held up beautifully in peacetime testing. It held up considerably less well over North Vietnam, where American rules of engagement frequently required visual identification of a target before firing, which resulted in closing the gun range against an enemy that very much did have a cannon. The US Navy's Phantoms drew first blood early on. By June 1917 and 1965, an F-4B from the Freelancers of VF-21 flying off the USS Midway shot down the first North Vietnamese MiG of the war. The Air Force had its own kill soon after, and the F-4 crews began learning the hard way in real time exactly how a missile-only fighter handles in a knife fight against a small, nimble, gun-armed MiG-17 or MiG-21, flown by pilots who had absolutely nothing to lose by getting in close. Early Sparrows and Sidewinders had genuine poor reliability figures under real combat conditions. Missiles that simply failed to launch, failed to guide, or detonated too far away from the target to do meaningful damage. These were constant and maddening features of the Phantom combat reports throughout the war. Pilots kept finding themselves forced into gun range, flying a large heavy interceptor that had no gun against a small, spry adversary built for exactly that kind of fight. The centerpiece of Americans' education on this point, and quite possibly the single most audacious set piece of the entire war, was Operation Bolo. By late '66, the F-105 Thunder Chief, the workhorse strike aircraft over North Vietnam, was taking a beating from the North Vietnamese MiG-21s, which had learned that the bomb-laden thuds were slow, predictable, and largely unable to fight back. Colonel Robin Ault, commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, already a double ace from his flying days in the P-38s and P-51s over Europe in the Second World War, had had enough of watching his strike packages get picked apart. His plan was simple, in a way that all true devious plans are simple. Send F-4 Phantoms in, flying the exact routes, altitudes, speeds, and radio call signs that the F-105 strike package has always used. Carry the same electronic jamming pods that the thuds carried. Make yourself look to the North Vietnamese radar in every conceivable way like an easy, bomb-heavy target. Then, don't be one. On January the 2nd, 1967, that's exactly what happened. Ault's formation of F-4Cs flew the familiar thud route into North Vietnam, while a second Phantom wing came in from the east to cut off any escape route towards China. The North Vietnamese MiG-21s climbed through the cloud layer expecting slow, defenseless bombers. What they found instead was Phantoms that were armed for bear. Ault's wingman, Lieutenant Ralph Wetham, opened the scoring. He used a Sparrow. Ault followed moments later with a Sidewinder kill of his own. Within 12 minutes, 7 MiG-21s, that's roughly half of North Vietnam's entire operational fleet at that time, had been destroyed. American losses? 0. It remains one of the most lopsided single engagements of the entire Vietnam Air War, and it did exactly what Ault intended. It rattled the North Vietnamese confidence badly enough that MiG activity dropped off sharply for the weeks that followed. Ault became something close to a legend, both for Bolo and for his leadership of the Wolfpack, which finished the war at the top MiG-killing wing in the entire theatre. Vietnam also gave the Phantom a second quieter mission that would go on to define much of its later career, hunting the radars behind North Vietnam's increasingly dangerous surface-to-air missile networks. Early Wild Weasels, F-100Fs and F-105Fs, pioneered this mission, but as the war ground on and the specialised F-105G Wild Weasels dwindled in numbers, F-4C Phantoms were pressed into the same radar hunting role, escorting strike packages and drawing enemy SAM radars into the open long enough to be attacked. It was punishing high-risk work. Deliberately advertising yourself as a bait for the surface-to-air crew is not a job with a long life expectancy on paper, but it planted the seed for far more specialised Phantom variants that we'll come back to later. On May the 10th, 1972, Lieutenant Randy Duke Cunningham and his Rio, Lieutenant William P. Driscoll, flying an F-4J with the call sign Showtime 100, shot down 3 MiG-17s in a single engagement over Haiphong, becoming the first American ace of the Vietnam War. Their 5th kill that day was believed at the time to be the mysterious North Vietnamese ace known as Colonel Toon, a figure whose subsequent research strongly suggests never actually existed, which is its own small lesson on how quickly legends outrun the paperwork in the fog of war. On the flight home, their damaged Phantom was struck by a surface-to-air missile and became uncontrollable in normal flight attitude. Cunningham flew it home upside down until both men could eject safely over the water. It's worth pausing on a number here, because it's one of the most repeated, most oversimplified statistic in American aviation folklore. The popular version of the story, cemented in a certain 1986 Tom Cruise movie, goes like this. American kill ratios collapsed to roughly 2.5 to 1 early in the war. The Navy panicked, founded the Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, in Miramar in March of 1969. Roll the music. And the kill ratios then rocketed to somewhere close to 12 to 1 for the rest of the conflict. Now, that's a great story. It's also, according to historians who've gone back through the underlying engagement data, considerably tidier than what actually happened. Most careful reconstructions of the Navy's full wartime record put the overall kill ratio for the entire war closer to around 4.7 to 1. With MiG combat and air patrol missions specifically running somewhat higher across the whole war, and higher still in the Top Gun years. A really meaningful improvement, just not the dramatic leap from the disaster to the dominance that the movie sells. Don't always believe the movies, kids. Now, the Ault report of 1968 that triggered Top Gun's creation was generally responding to real problems, chiefly missile reliability and the inadequate training in visual combat. But the raw before and after numbers usually quoted don't really survive close scrutiny. Top Gun mattered, it just didn't single-handedly rescue the Navy from a 2.5 to 1 disaster, because the disaster in those exact terms wasn't quite what the record remembers. By the war's end, the Navy's Phantom Squadron had flown 84 combat deployments, claiming roughly 40 aerial victories and lost 71 aircraft in combat, both to enemy fighters, surface-to-air missiles, and overwhelmingly to anti-aircraft artillery, the least glamorous but consistently lethal of the entire conflict. 54 more were lost to accidents. It's a sober reminder that flying a heavy supersonic jet off a pitching aircraft carrier at night carried its own risks entirely independent of the enemy. So here's the thing about building over 5,000 examples of what is genuinely an excellent Cold War fighter. Eventually everybody else wants one. By the time production wound down, the Phantom had been built under license or was otherwise operated by 11 foreign air forces, including Britain, Germany, Israel, Japan, Iran, South Korea, Turkey, Spain, Greece, Egypt, and for a time Australia, that leased a batch of F-4Es in the early 1970s as a stopgap while they were waiting for the delayed F-111 order to arrive. Spain flew a modest fleet of ex-US Navy F-4Cs and RF-4Cs in the late 1990s, using them both for air defence and reconnaissance duties over the Western Mediterranean. Egypt, in one of the more politically fascinating footnotes of the entire Phantom story, took delivery of F-4Es in the late 1970s. A genuinely remarkable turnaround for a country that had spent the previous 2 decades flying Soviet MiGs against Israeli-operated Phantoms, and a small quiet signal of just how completely the regional picture had shifted. After 1979, the Egypt and Israel peace treaty, Egypt Phantoms remained in service until 2010, before finally being retired. We don't have time in one video to do full justice to every single one of these air forces, so let's spend some real time with the ones that carry the richest combat stories, the strangest engineering compromises, and in a couple of cases, service lives that were remarkable and technically still ongoing. The Israeli Air Force received its first F-4Es in 1969, in the tense years immediately following the 1967 Six-Day War, and gave them a name that tells you everything about their intended use: Kurnass, Hebrew for sledgehammer. Israel needed an aircraft that could win air superiority against Soviet-supplied Egyptian and Syrian MiGs, while simultaneously reaching deep into enemy territory to strike airfields and infrastructure, and the Phantom, with its combination of speed, payload and range, was built exactly for this job. But the defining moment came in October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, when Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack that caught Israel dangerously flat-footed. In the opening minutes of the war, more than 200 Egyptian aircraft took part in an initial strike. Israel's response was at first alarmingly small, just a single pair of scrambled Phantoms. They launched before anyone fully grasped the scale of what was unfolding. In just a few minutes of furious, badly outnumbered combat, these 2 aircraft shot down 7 Egyptian MiGs and forced the rest to disengage. It was a wildly lopsided result, achieved by exactly the kind of pilots the Phantom had been attracting since its first record-breaking test flights back in 1959. Over the course of the war, Israel F-4 crews claimed an extraordinary number of aerial victories. Published figures put the total above 80 enemy aircraft destroyed for roughly 30 Phantoms lost, though, as with most intense air combat statistics, compiled in the chaos of a multi-front war fought in barely 3 weeks, the exact figures vary between sources, and precise numbers are hard to prove. By the 1980s, the F-15 Eagle and F-16 Fighting Falcon had taken over the air superiority mission for Israel, and the aging Phantom fleet and the Kurnass settled into the ground attack and reconnaissance work. The Kurnass 2000 modernization program of the 1980s gave the fleet a substantial avionics overhaul, keeping the airframes relevant for another 2 decades. Israel finally retired the last operational F-4s in 2004, closing out 35 years of continuous service in some of the most contended airspace on Earth. So if Israel's story is one of urgent operational necessity, then the British Phantom story is one of industrial policy turning up absolutely everywhere it wasn't wanted. When the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force went shopping for a new fighter in the mid-1960s, the American F-4 was clearly the best option on the table. But there was a distinctly British catch. The government wasn't thrilled about buying an entirely American airplane, engines included, when Rolls-Royce had perfectly good turbofans sitting on the shelf that it would very much like somebody to buy. So the deal that got struck was this: Britain would buy the Phantom, but only if it was fitted with the Rolls-Royce Spey turbofan instead of the standard American General Electric's J79s. On paper that sounds like a minor swap. In practice, It meant redesigning the entire rear fuselage and air intakes to accommodate an engine that had a very different airflow profile, because the Spey needed considerably more air than the J79 it was replacing. McDonnell obliged, reluctantly. One imagines given that the engineering headache involved, and what resulted was the F-4K for the Royal Navy and the F-4M for the RAF, entering British service as the Phantom FG1 and the FGR.2 respectively. The Spey-powered British Phantoms were in fairness an improvement in some respects, with better low-speed thrust, useful for short field and carrier operations, but they also picked up extra drag from the wider intakes, which cost them some of the raw top-end speed of the American original. It was in other words a textbook case of political compromise, producing an airplane that was different rather than simply better, though British air crews, being British air crews, made it work admirably regardless. Royal Navy's FG1s flew from the HMS Ark Royal until the carrier's withdrawal in 1978, at which point the Fleet Air-armed Phantoms transferred to the RAF squadrons at Lucas in Scotland, where they'd spent the years intercepting Soviet bombers probing British airspace over the North Sea. The RAF's FGR.2s, meanwhile, served extensively with the RAF Germany, armed, like so many Cold War fighters of the era, with the capability to deliver tactical nuclear weapons if the unthinkable ever happened. Then, in 1982, the unthinkable happened somewhere else entirely. 8,000 miles south to be precise, in the Falkland Islands, and the British Phantom fleet found itself facing a logistical problem nobody had quite planned for. Argentina's invasion meant that a squadron of FGR.2s had to be deployed down to the Ascension Island on a quick reaction alert duty, protecting the crucial staging base that supported the entire British task force heading south. That deployment, however, left a gap at the home defence, and Britain's solution was pleasingly pragmatic. Let's buy 15 second-hand ex-US Navy F-4Js. Refurbish them, fit some British equipment, and press them into RAF service as the F-4G UK to plug the hole. These jets kept the original American General Electric engines throughout, which meant for a few years Britain was simultaneously operating 3 subtly different versions of the same basic aeroplane, for reasons that boiled down to industrial policy, an unexpected war, and just genuine tight timelines. British Phantoms remained in the RAF's primary interceptor role until the Tornado F-3 finally took over the air defence in 1989 to 1992, depending on the squadron. They had roughly 20 years of service for an airplane that began life as a compromise between American engineering and British engine manufacturing pride, and somehow turned out excellent anyway. Germany's relationship with the Phantom began as an act of desperate relief. Through the 1960s, the Luftwaffe had been flying the Lockheed F-104G Starfighter, an aircraft whose loss rate in German service was really bad, with well over 100 aircraft written off, with more than half of those crashes fatal, which resulted in the grim nickname, the Widowmaker. When the time came to replace it, West Germany wanted something that wouldn't kill quite so many of its own pilots, and settled on a purpose-built variant of the F-4E called the F-4F. Slightly lightened, with some of the equipment removed to control costs, and initially at least, without the Sparrow missile capability that gave the American versions its beyond visual range punch. The Luftwaffe's F-4F entered service in 1973 under the appropriately hopeful program name Peace Rhine, and went on to fly an astonishing 279,000 flight hours over the following 4 decades. In the 1980s, the aircraft's air-to-air capability looked increasingly dated against the newer Soviet fighters, so Germany launched the Improved Combat Efficiency Program, universally known as ICE. Now this fitted the Phantom with the same Hughes APG-65 digital radar used in the F-18 Hornet, and gave its ability to fire the AIM-120 AMRAAM, one of the most capable air-to-air missiles in the Western arsenal at the time. It was in effect a Cold War jet getting a genuinely modern digital brain grafted in, and the ICE standard F-4Fs remained credible interceptors right through to the very end of their service. The end came in June 29, 2013, when the Luftwaffe formally retired the F-4Fs at Wittmund Air Base in a farewell event that the aviation press, with admirable comment to the pun universally dubbed the Phantom Farewell. 40 years of Peace Rhine began, the Eurofighter took over, and the Germans' Phantoms, some which were individually logged with over 7,000 flight hours, went into retirement or museum display, ending one of the longest and, thanks to ICE, most technologically evolved Phantom careers of any operator in the world. Next up, Japan's Phantom story, which in its own way is one of the more remarkable in the entire list, because Japan didn't just buy the airplane, it built it itself. The Japan Air Self-Defense Force placed an order for the F-4EJ in the late 1960s. It took first delivery starting in 1971. They had 138 of its eventual 154 aircraft assembled domestically under license by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, using parts shipped over from the United States. It remains to this day the largest F-4 production effort ever undertaken outside of America's soil. Constitutional restrictions of Japan's post-war military meant that the Phantoms were configured purely for air defense, without the offensive strike capability the Americans and other export versions carried. A reminder that even an aircraft this globally standardized still had to bend to the specific politics of the country flying it. In 1984, Japan began its own midlife modernization, the Kai Modified Upgrade Program, fitting a Westinghouse APG-66J pulse Doppler radar, a new mission computer, and improved navigation and identification equipment, keeping the airframe relevant into the 21st century. Now, no Phantom operator story has taken quite as strange a turn as Iran's. Under the Shah, Iran was one of America's closest regional allies, and before the 1979 revolution purchased well over 200 F-4D and F-4E Phantoms, one of the largest and most modern Phantom fleets outside the United States itself, reflecting Iran's role as a Western-aligned power in the Persian Gulf. Then came the revolution, and with it, a total severance of Iran's relationship with its primary arms supplier, especially as within 18 months, the country found itself fighting an enormously costly 8-year war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Iranian F-4 crews carried out some of the most audacious missions in the entire Iran-Iraq war, despite this isolation. In September 1980, in Operation Scorched Sword, Iranian Phantoms launched a preemptive strike against Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor complex. And in 1981, the so-called H-3 raid saw Iranian F-4s fly an extraordinary long-range mission deep into western Iraq, destroying dozens of Iraqi aircraft caught on the ground. A genuinely impressive fleet of planning and endurance flying for crews operating under crushing international sanctions and dwindling spare parts. That parts problem would never really go away. Cut off from American supply chain that every other operator on this list could still draw on, Iran built its own indigenous overhaul and reverse engineering industry to keep the fleet flying, manufacturing replacement structural parts domestically that have kept aging airframes airworthy for a genuinely remarkable length of time given the circumstances. By the mid-2020s, credible estimates put Iranian's F-4 fleet at somewhere around 60 aircraft, making it on paper at least the largest Phantom operator left in the world, a reflection less of the aircraft's continued relevance than of Iran's decades-long inability to replace it with anything newer. That fleet has unfortunately continued to see real combat use in the current decade, including during the Israeli-Iran conflict that erupted in 2026, with reported strikes destroying examples on the ground. Back at home, the US Air Force's own Phantom story had one more chapter left to write before it slipped quietly into retirement, and it belonged to a specialized variant called the F-4G Wild Weasel. The Wild Weasel mission, hunting and destroying radars belonging to enemy surface-to-air missiles so that strike aircraft behind you don't get shot down, dates back to the earliest and most dangerous days over North Vietnam. But in the F-4G, modified in F-4E, with its cannon removed and replaced by an APR-47 radar hunting electronics suite, took the mission to its highest level of refinement. Crews flying the F-4G weren't hunting airplanes, they were hunting radar emissions, locating the hostile missile site by its own transmissions and putting a HARM anti-radiation missile straight down the beam before it could fire a single shot in anger. Operation Desert Storm in January and February of 1991 would turn out to be both the first and only combat deployment that the F-4G ever saw, and they made an absolute most of it. The F-4Gs from the 35th and 52nd Tactical Fighter Wings flew nearly 4,000 combat sorties over Iraq and the Kuwait, launched roughly 1,000 air-to-ground missiles, and were credited with destroying around 200 Iraqi missile sites, gutting Iraq's integrated air defense network in the opening days of the war, so thoroughly that the coalition strike aircraft losses stayed remarkably low for the scale of the campaign. The Weasels paid a price for flying the mission, deliberately advertising themselves to enemy radar operators as bait, but remarkably, only a single F-4G was lost in the entire war, its fuel tank punctured by ground fire on a night mission, with both crew members ejecting safely. By January 1996, the F-4G's mission had been handed over to the specially modified F-16s, and the last operational American Phantom of any type stood down for good. It was quite almost bureaucratic end to the airplane that at various points over 35 years been the US Navy's primary fleet interceptor, the US Air Force's primary Vietnam-era fighter bomber, and finally its most specialised and dangerous mission of all. Retired Phantoms didn't entirely vanish, mind you. Hundreds were converted into QF-4 target drones, remotely flown and deliberately shot down in weapons testing. A strange and slightly melancholy final duty for the airplanes that had once been amongst the most capable fighters on Earth. The last of those drone conversions kept flying into the mid-2010s, 2 decades after the type supposedly retired. Which brings us at long last to the right now. Because remarkably, the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, an airplane whose first prototype flew in 1958, has not yet finished its story. South Korea flew Phantoms for 55 years, from 1969 all the way up to the formal retirement ceremony in June 7, 2024. The final flight of the Republic of Korea's Air Force Phantom F-4E fleet on that day was a flypast by the F-16, F-15 and F-35s that would come to replace it. With Korea's retirement, only 3 Phantom operators remain, standing anywhere on Earth: Greece, Turkey and Iran. Now, Greece has flown F-4Es since 1974. Its jet modernised under the Peace Icarus 2000 avionics upgrade program, and remains for now a committed operator of Phantoms flying regularly in NATO exercises and instantly recognisable for their striking Aegean ghost grey camouflage as they thread low through Greek mountain canyons. Turkey, meanwhile, has operated the type since 1970 and still maintains a single dedicated squadron, the 111 Philo the Panthers, flying upgraded F-4Es alongside modernised reconnaissance variants. Both nations have announced plans to eventually retire the type in favour of F-35s, Rafales, or Turkey's own domestically developed Khan fighter, which will leave Iran as the very last operator of an airplane that first took it to the air during the Eisenhower administration. Nobody is quite sure yet when that final retirement will actually happen. Given the Phantom's demonstrated 7-decade habit of outliving every single retirement date ever predicted for it, perhaps the safest thing to say is don't bet against it sticking around for a little while longer than expected. So, 68 years, 5,195 airframes later, was the F-4 Phantom II actually a great fighter or just a lucky one? The honest answer depends entirely on which question you're asking. If you're asking what was the single most technically refined, purpose-built air superiority fighter of its generation, the Phantom probably isn't your answer. That title likely belongs to something more specialised, built later, with the benefit of everything the Phantom's own combat record taught the industry. The Phantom, remember, went into the war in Vietnam without a gun, because the 1955 doctrine insisted it wouldn't need one, and paid for that mistake in blood before anyone fixed it. But if you're asking which fighter did more to actually shape the second half of the 20th century in the air, the doctrines, the entire careers of fighter pilots on 4 continents, there's generally no competition. This is an airplane that fought on opposing sides of the same regional conflict simultaneously in the skies over the Middle East, that anchored NATO's European front line and Turkey's own airspace duties, that trained future astronauts on its record-breaking test flights and hunted Soviet-designed SAM radars on its final combat missions. It's the greatest fighter that an entire generation of pilots, American, British, German, Israeli, Japanese, Iranian, Korean, Greek and Turkish, learned to fly, fight and See, that's the real Phantom verdict. Not the best dogfighter ever built, but quite possibly the most consequential one. It's worth noting too that this airplane's cultural footprint outlasted its own frontline career almost everywhere. The smoky, thundering silhouette of a Phantom launching off a carrier deck that became a visual shorthand of American air power in a popular imagination of a full generation, long before a certain fictional call sign named Maverick ever climbed into the cockpit at all. Few fighters managed to be simultaneously a punchline for their own ugliness, a genuine engineering triumph, and a piece of... So that's it, folks. That's my little homage to what is a 70-year-old airframe, and probably one of the most remarkable planes to ever grace the skies. If you've enjoyed this episode, hit that like, subscribe to the channel, because it will mean a massive amount to me, and for every subscription I will guarantee you this, I will try to improve my videos, give you better content, and hopefully keep you entertained. So until the next time, this is Jaxom Talks. I'll see you then. Bye.